So Evil Dead Rise is the fifth film in the Evil Dead franchise. If you think of it as a long-standing franchise, we originally had Evil Dead 1 and 2 from director Sam Raimi, hot out of film school, right? Young director with his buddies up in Michigan, like shooting a movie at a cabin over the summer. That turned into Evil Dead 2, like larger production, shot in a local high school mostly, like in the gymnasium. They built like cabin rooms and shot it. Army of Darkness comes out just a few years later after he makes Darkman, much larger production. And that one is much bigger in scale, right? Features a medieval setting. Our hero Ash escapes to, or I guess gets trapped in time to fight the Deadites. But then kind of silence for a while. Evil Dead doesn't really go anywhere. Builds a cult following. Evil Dead 2013 comes out from director Fede Alvarez. That was also written and produced by Sam Raimi, and Bruce Campbell has a cameo at the end of the credits, but otherwise is a spin on Evil Dead in the cabin, right? The teenagers all show up for the weekend. One of them finds a book. He reads a passage out of it, the Necronomicon, and the dead all show up and take over. Well, Evil Dead Rise is here now in 2023 for a new spin from a new writer and director, Lee Cronin, who's actually done a couple features. He did The Hole in the Ground, which was a horror feature from like 2019 that we didn't see, but I remember seeing trailers for it and thinking like, oh, okay, sure. Apparently he fancies Evil Dead, and many of us do, right? And he'd written this script that I think Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell read and thought, you know what? This one's got legs. It's different. It follows just enough of the Evil Dead like formula while also being new. Evil Dead Rise follows two sisters, adults, one of which has a family, the other which is a bit more wayward, who are at their high-rise apartment one night, just kind of getting together to figure out life. When suddenly, following an earthquake, one of them discovers some recordings in an underground vault. They take it back up to the house. They give it a spin on their vinyl player, and it turns out it is a reading from the Book of the Dead, and that summons the beast that flies up to the apartment, possesses one of the sisters, and as we've seen in the trailer, becomes a horrific night where the family has to escape, else they be dead by dawn. Evil Dead Rise is like 97 minutes. It's a $15 million budget, and that way I think it's in the spirit of the original Evil Dead, right? Small, from somebody kind of new in the horror space. Andy, what'd you think?
I thought this was a lot of fun. I liked it a lot. It has a ton of energy. It just kind of keeps getting more and more intense the longer it goes. It's just like a kind of a giant crescendo. And it touches on things that are popular that have happened in the franchise, things like the reading of the words from the evil book, and a number of things like that. But it doesn't do the Star Wars things where it's just nostalgia bait, where it's just like, hey guys, remember this from the original? It keeps those to a minimum, and it's much more graphic and violent. Like I said, the original first two Evil Dead are it's kind of like a horror comedy almost. And this is just kind of blatant, pretty gross out comedy. There's so much blood and gore, and they definitely really lean into it. There's a good reference to The Shining, as happens in almost every horror movie. I thought it was a lot of fun.
So I like this movie. Okay. Honestly, I think it's a case of kind of being overhyped, right? Like the first time I saw the trailer for Evil Dead Rise, I was like, taken aback in my chair, right? Like lost my breath. Every time a Red Band trailer has run in a theater, like before a movie, I've thought, Evil Dead? Is it the Evil Dead trailer? I'm going to see it again? Like I was way too excited for this movie. And I think a lot of Evil Dead fans would be, right? Like this movie kind of has a lot to put on its shoulders, unfortunately. Like, and in that way, I think like as a new horror feature, like considering what's out there right now, I think it's pretty good. Like I really do. I think it checks the boxes. Like it's kind of scary. It's kind of funny. And it doesn't have as much suspense as I think I'd hope, but it's got all the foundational elements of an Evil Dead movie, like the Necronomicon, the Deadites, like weird body horror, strange liquids coming out of people of various colors, and people screeching on wall, like all kinds of stuff, right? Like I think all that works out great. It's even got the kind of survive the night theme. But as like a Evil Dead movie, like I think it's just kind of fine. I think it's fine. And I think the reason that is because Evil Dead Rise like lacks a certain feeling of suspense that the other movies did better. Evil Dead 2013 is like surprisingly slow. surprisingly slow. And a lot of those scares are like really long buildups, right? Like I know it takes place in a cabin. This takes place in a high rise. There's a few more people in this one. But Evil Dead Rise or Evil Dead 2013, like took its time with a lot of scares. Like it would really slowly zoom in on a character that's possessed, right? And it'd just be agony for like 18 seconds, these slow pans. Like really slow pans around a room. This movie moves a lot faster. It's much more efficient. It's cut a lot quicker. And I think that gives it a kind of new energy that's good for new audiences. But if you're an Evil Dead fan, it may not embrace you the way I think Evil Dead 2013 did. That one was very much trying to be, cater to old horror fans. This one is for new folks. And like, I think in that way, it's solid, definitely. So let's talk about it. First things first, our setting, right? And our characters. We've got our two sisters. We've got their 3 kids of varying ages, and we've got our high rise in New York, I think. I don't even know if they
LA.
actually said. Okay, it's in LA. Yeah, I wasn't even sure of the setting.
Meant into LAX.
The big question to ask, how do you have an apartment full of people screaming their heads off and not have the neighbors come over and check it out, right? I talked about it a couple weeks ago on the show. I said, how are they going to do that? Like, how are you going to answer that question, right? Like, if a dead-eyed is screaming in an apartment, the people above, below, and next to them are all going to hear it. Probably everybody's going to hear it. And Evil Dead Rise actually has a really clever way of writing around that. Our two sisters are not particularly well off. They're both struggling, actually, financially and otherwise, in their relationships, which is a surprisingly deep bit of something to our characters. And this apartment they're in is in a building that's functionally condemned. They're actually like in the process of packing and moving out. So most of the apartments are empty. And the people on the floor that are nearby are nice and helpful and actually do appear in the movie as characters. But due to functionally like an earthquake that rattles the building and actually opens this kind of hole in the parking garage where one of them ends up going down and finding this kind of hidden vault down there, that ends up taking out their elevator and functionally the stairs. So they're kind of trapped on this floor and can't go up or down or in or out. And more interestingly, it's raining so hard in this storm that they can't shout down from the 9th floor to anybody on the 1st floor, and the cell phone towers are out, so they can't use phones. It's kind of perfect. Like, I was surprised at how well it closes off every available option in this very small, round of options to them. They don't really have anywhere to go. They try to make it for a fire escape at one point, but otherwise, like, the survive the night element is pretty good as far as the setting's concerned.
Yeah, that's what it does really well. That compares to the original Evil Dead. So the original Evil Dead is you're out in a cabin in the woods. That's replaced by they're stuck in an apartment in the city, but it's still they're stuck in one location. So like that part is what's similar. And I wanted to comment on something you said. One thing I heard is that like this movie could stand on its own without actually being an Evil Dead movie. It could have just been a great horror piece without kind of the Evil Dead tie-in. It still works, I think, for the most part. But yeah, the setting is really clever. They're in this what is kind of a giant apartment, but still the building's old. It's condemned. There's weird people living there. We meet a couple of characters briefly out in the hall before the inevitable happens and the possession takes place.
Yeah, and that's worth talking about, the possession, right? Because that's a big element of Evil Dead movies. Like, it's not just some kind of slasher running around, and it's not necessarily just some identifiably evil demon or force. It is like the demons, right, that like come from the other side, and it's never really explained. All of this happens, of course, because you read from the Book of the Dead, which does make an appearance in this movie, that I think is done pretty well. I think like the trappings of new Evil Dead are strong, based on like the current, I don't know, horror environment.
The meta.
Like, I kept thinking watching this, like in front of Evil Dead Rise, there was a trailer for like Insidious 5, Insidious the Red Door. And like you think of that and you think of like Spiral, the new Saw movie, you think of Blumhouse horrors. And like in that way, I think this movie feels very contemporary. It feels like a movie that's made in 2023 for sure. It doesn't have like necessarily a timeless quality to it, and I'm not sure any of them do. I think old Evil Dead is really just beloved because it was so charming, like in its simplicity, and its kind of straight edge approach to horror. But this movie does have that straight edge like appeal in its like presentation of Deadites, dude. Like the demons are evil. And our
Yeah,
kind of lead Deadite, played by Alyssa Shaw, I think is her name, is really
Sutherland,
tremendous. Sorry, what's that?
Alyssa Sutherland.
Alyssa Sutherland. Yeah, it's really tremendous. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can see we've got her up on screen here. She like shambles around and it's got like really great makeup and FX. Combine that with like a ton of blood and like big body horror, like, jaws unhinging, like people chewing on glass and like all kinds of weird stuff that like really can crank up this feeling of like, oh God, what nightmare have we walked into, And like I think that makes for a pleasant experience, like for the audience to watch these characters have to try to endure, because they're trapped, like they're in this place where they can't get out. And in that way, like Evil Dead Rise hits all the highlights, like it hits every mark, I think.
Yeah, her performance is so good because she has to be everything. She has to be loving mother, deadite, zombie of the damned, where she's stumbling around but also maimed half the time or getting maimed, and there's lots of screaming, and so she has to act like a possessed person zombie thing for a lot of the film, and then also tie in with like really like sweet motherly thing because at one point she's like locked out of the apartment. She's trying to convince one of the youngest daughter to let her back in, and so it's this really cruel juxtaposition of she looks horrible, but she has this really sweet like motherly voice, and it makes for a really strong performance, and she has to do a lot of it. Like she's really carrying a lot of the film.
It lifts that gag of like being locked out of the apartment and like trying to get back in and trying to be sweet, like talk to the daughter, from Old Evil Dead, right? Like Henrietta, like the mother who gets resurrected when the Book of the Dead is read in the old one, is locked in the basement of the cabin and she's trying to get out. And at one point she kind of turns back into mom and is like singing a lullaby to her daughter. And she's like, well, maybe that is my mom. And they're like, don't let her out of there. It's not her. Like that is one of those things that comes like right out of Old Evil Dead. And it works well, I think. In that way, I think the script for Evil Dead Rise is probably its strongest element because Lee Cronin, the director, wrote it. He penned it and he showed it to Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, and they were like, this one's the one. It's got all the hits of old Evil Dead. It's got the mom, it's got the kids, it's got your wayward stranger who's arrived to try to, not really help with the situation, but ends up becoming like a hero of their own, whatever. All that comes from there. Like it hits every one of those marks really well. I think where I struggled with it was just kind of functionally in its direction because of its pacing. And also low key the lighting. The lighting in this movie is like really intentional. Like it's really directional. And like, man, Old Evil Dead's not that way. It's very natural light. Like, they were just kind of using what they had. They had a couple light bulbs they'd rig up on a thing and Sam Raimi, put a light over there, Rob, and and then the Evil Dead Rise, I think, or Evil Dead 2013 kind of had the same appeal. They tried to use a lot of daylight. Like they tried to shoot a lot of like kind of natural light and big shadows. Whereas this movie, like, even though most of it takes place at night, the apartment's pretty well lit. Like they got candles everywhere. You can see what's going on. And I think like dynamic lighting and fast pacing makes it feel just a bit different than like what I think I expected coming out of Evil Dead 2013.
Right. And see, I never saw the Evil Dead 2013. I've seen the rest of them. So I don't know how to compare it, but like you said, it's much more modern in its trappings. Like they don't do the kind of Three Stooges style humor that are in the original. It's very brutal, lots of gore, lots of body horror, a lot of brutal kills, and everyone's up for grabs. I love when they use a cast of relatively unknown people because you have no idea who's going to survive. Like, if Tom Cruise was in Evil Dead, he's not surviving, or he's surviving, that sort of thing. So it helps when you have a cast of you really don't know who's gonna make it.
Yeah, the kids in the trailer, like the family, like they're not the only kids in the feature. There's a couple kids who live like 2 doors down from them. And a lot of people had hopped online after this came out and they were like, oh, here we go. Evil Dead's not going to have the guts to kill kids in 2023. I don't even think they kill kids in any of the other features. I think this is a new addition to the formula. But boy, like I didn't know what they were going to do. And they figured out a way to satisfy that. I think very, very satisfying answer.
in a discussion about uh, the Stephen King adaptation, I heard
Yeah.
someone say like there's two kinds of horror movies. There's ones where they will kill the kids and ones where they won't.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember like Doctor Sleep, like Jacob Tremblay getting like ripped apart,
Yeah.
like screaming and crying the whole time. Yeah, man, that's definitely a way to go. But I wanted to mention real quick because I gotta stop talking about old Evil Dead. That's not getting me anywhere. I want to talk about the humor in this movie. Evil Dead 2 was funny, like in a way that I think people didn't expect. Like Evil Dead 1 is played straight. Evil Dead 2 is kind of funny. Evil Dead 3 is like Three Stooges. And throughout each film, Ash, our protagonist, like gets progressively dumber, which is really funny. Like in the first one, he's soft, but ends up being a hero. In the second one, he's big heroic, but like pretty dumb. And at Army of Darkness, he's like Mo, Larry, and Curly. But in New Evil Dead, you don't need to really do that. Evil Dead 2013 makes no effort to be funny. It is just straight horror, which I think is a strong approach. And this one actually toes that line a bit. Watching the trailer, I thought it wouldn't be funny. But it is in a twisted, cynical, twirl your mustache kind of way. There's a scene in here of a character running away from one of our deadites. Like, that's just so goofy. Like, it's a comedy cut. And there's another scene of a character getting thrown through a door that is also a comedy cut. Like, it's like something out of Looney Tunes, and it feels a little out of place. I think if you don't know what to expect, or if you're not looking for it, you may just feel awkward. I think if you know it's supposed to be a little funny, like you get more enjoyment out of it. I guess that's your like big send out to old Evil Dead heads, right? You're like, yeah, it's got some funny bits like the old one. And I think that cynical humor is smart, especially when you get to the end of the film when you're working in like a shotgun or a chainsaw, right? Like that's the stuff that makes that like kind of outward element work in what's supposed to be a pretty grounded horror film for 2023. I wouldn't imagine the cast of Megan picking up a chainsaw. I wouldn't imagine
Right.
the cast of Insidious picking up a chainsaw. Like Evil Dead is going to put its flag in the ground and say we're that movie, and I think it gets there in a pretty satisfying way. I think, yeah.
Yeah, like I said, it's something that it keeps ramping up in energy in the kills, the gore, the body horror. Just when you think it's kind of gone as far as it can go, it finds a way to go even further. And like you said, the big promo image is one of the characters like completely covered in blood from head to toe, holding the chainsaw and a shotgun. So it's it's something else.
Yeah, it knows what it is. Yeah, I think in the current horror landscape, I think Evil Dead Rise is strong. I do. I don't think it will have the legs of like reverence like over time like the old ones do. And for what it's worth, like 2013 doesn't either, which is a shame. Like, not only do I think 2013 is good, I'm surprised how many people haven't seen it. And I'm a little surprised you haven't seen it, Andy. The guy I went and saw Evil Dead Rise with, same thing. He was like, oh yeah, I never saw that one. I was like, man, like that one's not bad. Like that's a pretty good horror movie. But like, well, it's fine. Maybe come October, maybe we'll watch Evil Dead like 2013. Anyway, we got to talk about whether or not we recommend this movie. I spent way too much time talking about old Evil Dead. Apologies. Probably should have reined myself in a little bit, but I feel like I said my piece. Andy, would you recommend Evil Dead Rise?
Would definitely recommend it for fans of horror, especially if you're a fan of Evil Dead. It's going to be right up your alley. There's a lot of nods to the original properties without overdoing it. It feels much more modern. Like I said, there's not as much kind of slapstick humor, but they really ramp up the body horror element. There's kind of the zombie possession side of it is really ramped up. Great performances from our leads, especially Alyssa Sutherland. And I think they'll probably make some more of these if this continues to make a lot of money. So I would, and that's who I would recommend it to.
I think I would wait for streaming on this one. It's fine, and if you really want to get into it, like totally go see it in theaters. I think you'll have a fun time. But being it's a smaller budget, being it's a smaller runtime, I think it's just kind of a smaller feature, and I don't think it hurts like watching it at home, like on the couch, under curled up under a blanket. Like I think that might actually give it a little something. Watching it in theaters, it's good. And like I said, I think for modern horror fans, they'll be into it. If I was like 16 and had never seen any of the Evil Dead movies and went and saw this, I would think this is original. I would think this has new ideas like that nobody else is doing. Like the possession thing is cool. The body horror is cool. Feels like nobody is safe in the movie. Dead by Dawn. All that works. But if you've seen Old Evil Dead, like you've seen that formula twice, like not including the sequels or the show or any other variations of it. So like in that way, it's a good horror movie. I just don't think it's a great Evil Dead movie. And like, that's totally fine. Evil Dead 2013 arguably wasn't either. So yeah. If you want to go see it in theaters, you should go check it out. Otherwise, like, I don't think you heard anything waiting to see it at home. And with that, we should talk about other things we should see in theaters. Andy, what's our next segment?
It's time for the trailer park.